Welcome to ABA Inside Track, the podcast that's like reading in your car, but safer. I'm your host, Robert Perry Cruz, for this special book club edition. And we've got a number of people in the virtual studio tonight to talk about behavior analysis and behavior analytic adjacent topics, say a behavior analytic adjacent book. And who's here? Who do we have here joining us for the book club tonight?
Hey, Rob, it's Diana.
And it's me, Jackie.
And who else do we have? We have other special guests.
Hey, it's me, Alan Haberman, BCBA now.
That's right. If you were like, who's this guy that keeps talking in all the book clubs? He's so smart. He must be a BCBA. Well, no, he wasn't. He fooled you, but now he is, so it's all good. And we have another special guest. Hey.
Hey, Rob, I'm Victoria.
Victoria, first-time joiner of the book club. I was going to say the circle, but it's like a square because we're on Zoom right now. So thank you. So Victoria, thank you so much for joining us, for subscribing, and then for coming to talk about the book that we'll be talking about that I haven't introduced yet. Victoria, for your first time on, do you want to say a few words about yourself to the listeners out there?
Sure. I'm a recent BCBA. I got my certification back in June. I'm very passionate about the field. I'm already looking at PhD programs, and I love this field. I feel like the moment I got into it, I was in love, and it was just like I found my tribe. So I'm loving it. I love talking behavior analysis, so I feel like this is a perfect forum, and I'm excited for today.
Oh, well, I hope you keep that excitement for the
for this book, not as much this book as some of the other content you guys have had on before, but still excited.
It's a great time to join. Well, everyone, I think we're dodging around it, but we are talking this episode about I don't know if it's not really a classic, but it's sort of become this like instant hit, Nudge by Richard Thaler and R.H Sunstein. And this was sort of like the hotness in the behavioral economics field. And I think it became even hotter because Richard Thaler won the Nobel-prize for economics like 2-3 years ago, I think, maybe a little bit farther back than that. So kind of a recent Nobel laureate. And we had done an episode on sustainability. And for our on the Patreon page, we said, let's do votes about books about changing the world or improving society. And so Nudge was one of our choices, and it was the winner of the poll. And I think at the time, I don't know about all of you, but I know I'd read the Nudge second edition, and we'd kind of put it back in the poll because there was a third edition, a final edition, they call it, that came out just this past year. And Richard Thaler was on Freakonomics and telling everyone like, oh, it's the last time we're going to update this version. And, we'll get into a little bit of that when we talk a little bit of the book's history. And we thought, you know what? Behavioral economics, behavior analysis, there's so much in common there. I think we should branch out a little bit, and we'll talk about Nudge. This book's been such a hit because I'd read it back in, I don't know, like the early 2010s, I think, and I had really enjoyed the second edition. And coming back to read it now, I don't know why I thought that. So that's my personal background on Nudge. How about the rest of you? Is this a first time read for everyone? Have people read it before, heard about this book?
I didn't have any idea who the authors were, and I didn't look at who the authors were before I opened the book because that's the kind of reader I am. And I'm like, who do they keep talking about when they would like give the last names? And I was like, I am so confused. And I even like Googled the names of the authors, and then like the book came up, and I was like, oh yeah. So I could have just turned to the front page and see that they were referring to themselves in the book. But I actually
Thaler loves Diet Coke, but Sunstein loves red wine.
Yeah, and I was like, who's Thaler? And I was like, put the book down, opened up my computer. So that was awkward.
So the big twist of Nudge for you, Jackie, was that the authors were in the book the whole time.
They were the main characters. No, and I had never read the book, nor had I really heard of the book, nor did I have any interest reading the book. So this one was an exciting one for me, but I did like the cover of the 3 little elephants. So I was like, it's going to be good. It's going to be great. I'm excited to read it. And you know what? In the beginning, I really was like, I'm in it to win it. And then I started petering out a little bit, but I finished it.
That's good. I'm glad you finished it to come to your own book club. Thank you, Jackie. What a pro.
You're welcome. You're welcome very much.
Alan, Victoria, what about you? Was this a new read for either of you, for both of you?
This was definitely a new read for me. I actually listened to the audiobook just because it's a lot like how I take in books. I read so much on a daily basis, or like I just rest my eyes listening to it. Like it was interesting taking it in that way versus without the visuals, because I ended up wanting to get an extra, like a physical copy so I could actually see the visuals they were talking about. Because like a lot of audiobooks, most audiobooks have like a accompanying like little like workbook or something to kind of give you the extra stuff that you don't have because you're listening to it.
Like when you get the lyrics book with the CD.
And they didn't provide that with this one. So I had to go get a copy, which I'm going to return on Amazon after we're done. Just so I could see the visuals.
Okay, Alan, how about you?
Yeah, I had heard of it. Obviously, winning the Nobel Prize, that makes you a staple in the field. And obviously all the like, don't mess with Texas ecology stuff that gets mentioned heavily is sort of noteworthy and will come up when you talk about ABA or behavior analysis outside of what we are normally associated with. But I never really read it before. And, it's better than Carnegie, but I'm still going to assign it to like the final edition can go on that shelf and definitely need to talk about it. But I did not care for this book.
Yeah. How about you, Diana? You got this for me.
I was excited to put this back on the list for the book club choices. And I was very excited when it won the book club choice because I really like Freakonomics. Like really like that book, and I thought that I was going to really, really love this book, and I still am shocked by how much I did not enjoy reading this book.
You were really struggling. I got to see it live,
and I was like, I'm going to be a behavioral economist. Like I was like ready to like switch tracks. I was like, Nudge is going to do it for me. I am so excited to like have this whole area like explained, and I still feel kind of murky about like what happened in portions of the book.
I think one of the, it's a behavioral economics book, but it is written for the masses, which I think does lend itself to, if you're a behavioral scientist and you're interested in what's all the behavioral economics they're always talking about. This isn't, I don't know if I'd recommend this as sort of a starter point, but it is very understandable in that regard. The second edition, I would say more so than the final edition, which I think really gave up a lot of the anyone can learn this sort of narrative that the final edition I don't think had.
Okay.
But again, that's my opinion. I only read one of them. I've read both of them in my lifetime. I only read one of them in preparation for this book club. I apologize. I didn't go back and reread the second edition and then read the final edition. So I skimmed it for about 40 minutes to try to remember why I liked the second edition and if it was just when I read it or if there was something different about the writing or the content. And I do think there was, but well, we can get into that discussion. So that's kind of the start of it. So again, we're already kind of giving away the ending. We weren't all huge fans of this book. Were there some interesting concepts in there? Was there, I think, content interesting to behavior analysts in terms of how do we take more complex behavior analytic principles and sort of de-jargonize them into somewhat complex but easier, I think, to understand for the layperson terms? Yeah, I think so. And then the book kind of goes off a cliff in the second half and doesn't do a lot of, I think, what I know I liked from the second edition, which was actually practical uses of nudge versus, hey, let's do a lecture on boring economic principles that nobody wanted to listen to when they bought this book, I'm guessing.
Yeah, because I think we want to be careful in our discussion here on separating what are the kernels of interesting behavioral economics that we can pull from this book that our audience would probably enjoy hearing about versus what I kept thinking about when I was reading the book is why is it not working for me as a piece of writing? Because I think that's two different things. And there is good stuff in here that we as behavior analysts, maybe agree with, but haven't ever thought about, right? And allow us to take that over into our world and, talk about it in our terms. I think there's a lot to pull from it. But I don't know. I'm not sure the progression from book 2 to book 3, what happened. But it's like a different discussion. Yeah.
I think my guess would be that Thaler is engaging in a conversation and trying that, like the idea of a final edition is like, I'm putting the capstone on what nudge is supposed to be with this. So I think that's where a lot of the more arcane lecture-y type of economics comes in. And also, it's funny, that wasn't what my problem with the book was. It's often just about sort of the nature of that conversation and who are having those conversations about like economists and economic theory and how nudge fits into the market landscape, the reality that we live in. Mm-hmm. So I think that's probably, my guess is that's where the weakness comes from, is that he's trying to keep that accessible piece, but also talk to economists and be like, I don't like what you're doing here with my baby.
It could be.
No, I think there was some talk to almost to critics. Like you could hear it in a number of different areas. Where I'm talking to the critics here. Like all the different times where this is something that was in my last book. You guys criticized it. Now I'm going to address it here. I'm like, okay.
Right. Here's my opinion. There was something here was our opinion in the first book. And then you obviously didn't read the first book well enough because that's not what we said. So let us clarify.
There's the organ donations chapter.
Right? Yeah, the organ donations chapter was big on that. And there was another chapter as well.
Well, the whole last section, there was in the second edition, there was a section on what do people not like about nudges. And that read very much like what might be some misperceptions, which I think are ones that behavior analysts hear all the time of I don't bribe my kids, or reinforcement. That's, I used it and it didn't work. Like those misunderstandings. I don't want anyone to tell me how to change my behavior. Like we're in a vacuum where your learning history is irrelevant to the behavior you engage in. But I think it did take a tone. Again, I didn't reread the full section from the second edition, but I think the third one did have a little bit more of a tone of, guess what, everybody? I won a friggin' Nobel Prize. So here's what I think of all your criticisms. Which, I mean, to be honest, if I won a Nobel Prize, I would write a chapter in anything I'd written and be like, everyone, if you ever said something mean to me, here's the chapter where I call you out because you're a dum-dum and I won a Nobel Prize. So
hilarious, because you totally would, Rob.
I'd be the worst. I just get up there and be like, I just want to get this is for all the haters out there who didn't think I deserved this Nobel Prize for chemistry because of my lack of qualifications or understanding of chemistry. Well, what do you think of me now, jerks?
And I think another thing that informed sort of my perception and sort of interaction with the book is that I was 21 when the first one came out. So my formative years have been one of being nudged all the time and recognizing some of what Thaler talked about, is talking about, etc. And I really hate a lot of those aspects of modern life. Mm. And so I'm like, great, I can blame this guy. Or at least the people that took his ideas and then just ignored the whole morality component, which is important for us as behavior analysts to remember, because that's a conversation we engage in to this day about, we introduce a tool, a technology, but with this ethical component, but people are like, oh, ethics, that makes it not profitable. And then do X, Y, and Z with what our tools and are very awful human beings sometimes.
I think one thing I would say for Thaler and Sunstein is they do have a very narrow definition, I think, of what a nudge is and is not. And rereading it, the first sections especially, I think it was helpful to sort of redefine their idea of a nudge, because I think what most people think of as a nudge, which we should probably define that term pretty soon, but they would say is a misuse of what they meant in the original book. But again, just like any sort of genie in a bottle situation, if you put out this idea, who's going to take the idea? Well, you're hoping, it's the people who want to benefit society. But in our capitalistic culture, it's probably going to be the people who are like, how can I make money off of people's behavior patterns. And how can I do it in a way that they don't know it's happening? Or even if they did know it's happening, they wouldn't care, or they think it is helpful in some way. And I would become richer by doing it. And to some extent, that's, well, to a huge extent, that's not what a nudge is meant to do. But again, it's not something, just like reinforcement. Like, you can use reinforcement in all sorts of different ways. It doesn't mean you're going to use it for good. You use it however you choose to use it. And, you know, we have ethical requirements about how we would or would not, you know, what's a harmful reinforcer. If you're a business person or even a government agent, you don't necessarily have that same code of ethics you are following, or the ethical code you follow is not the same. So you may think very little of using this technology to change behavior in ways that I think Thaler and Sunstein would say, that's not really a nudge. That's coercive, or that's doing something for your own gain. But what do they care? What do I care? I'm the business person. I want to call it a nudge, and people like that
business
term.
People that would disagree
with
your characterization.
Diana. I've been radicalized.
Person.
They're all the mean high executive people of the Hallmark movies that then lose their girlfriend and boyfriends when they move out to the country. That's who you're talking about, right, Rob?
Yep, that's it. It only took me 20 years after college to become really radicalized. I don't know why I decided now.
Right, but I think what you're talking about really, you know, moves us into the introduction when they talk about choice architects, right? Mm-hmm. Because they give a great example of someone, I think her name was Chloe. I can't remember. Was it Chloe? If I was, I'm like real.
She's a cafeteria. It's a hypothetical cafeteria worker.
But her name was Chloe, I think.
Named Chloe.
Yes. Right. And she has a master's degree, and her idea was looking at where food placement would go in the cafeteria, right? On whether children would be more likely to eat the healthy food that was in front of them versus on the bottom shelf versus top shelf. So I think that bringing in that concept of choice architect, I think, is an important thing that you've kind of segued us in, right? Because not all business people are out to make money, but they're the architects of how we are choosing in our environment, right? Because those are the variables that are there. And I think when we talk about choice architects, we're really looking at the salient cues in the environment that may make it more or less likely that our behavior is going to be emitted under those features.
I found it strange that they didn't call the book The Choice Architect, because so much more of it was about the idea of choice architecture, with nudge being a tool in the belt of the architect, you know, about the individual who's responsible to organize some context or set up systems that help people or hinder people from making meaningful decisions, you know, and the idea that anyone who sets up a system, which I think would apply to all of us, you get to be a choice architect, at least in some component of your job. And depending on how you set things up, there's no neutral, you know, it's just you're setting things up to make things easier or harder. Some behaviors are easier, some responses are harder. And that's your responsibility as the choice architect. And then nudge is one thing you can do as a choice architect.
Well, I think in that first section, they're also talking about all the different ways she could structure that, and like how they speak to how you could do it with profits as your motive. Like, she could absolutely use the stuff we're talking about to drive profits by the people who are going to give them the most money to get those food placements that are going to get them the most exposure and the most choice of most people choosing them. And then they're like, what we're talking about is the fact that we want to do good. Like, they're like, we're pointing to the fact that in many of these cases, if we talk about it from a moral angle, we want you to encourage you to use this knowledge for good. And in this case, this cafeteria designer putting those foods in the right places to encourage good eating is the moral decision to them. And that's what they're kind of like. It's like, this is the good way to use our science. And there are many other ways you could use it, but this is what we're trying to get at. So we're kind of trying to bring it back to, all right, this is our perspective, and this is how we're trying to kind of direct you into reading of the actual like science in the text going forward.
Yeah, I really appreciate that you brought that up, Victoria, because I think, again, as behavior analysts, we have to be mindful too, right, that whoever the choice architecture is lives in their own history of reinforcement and their own context, right? And it may not necessarily be the same as those that are choosing or on the choosing end, right? So I think that's one point that they didn't really bring up, right? Which behavior analysts and behavior analysis can kind of fulfill that, right? It's verbal behavior is only verbal behavior, right? And good and bad in terms of our, community in which we're in. So Chloe, our choice architect at school, may say, oh yeah, these are really great things to eat, right? But that's based on her own verbal community and her own knowledge base, right? And it may not necessarily represent the people that are choosing. So I wish that would have been in there a little bit. And they alluded to it slightly, Alan, right? But not as much as they wanted to.
No, so I actually was curious about like sort of what sort of the public policy side, and I found a really good article from 2018, Theory Nerd, I'm sorry, that does a really good operational definition. And it's that there's nudges, there's sort of three components: that it's an intervention that interferes with the choice conditions minimally, that's an intervention that uses rationality failures instrumentally, that is sort of acknowledges that people need help in choosing what's best for them sometimes. But then there's this third component that gets left out often, which is that it's a welfare promoting intervention that tries to reduce the negative effects of rationality failures. And that's a really important part. I like that, welfare promoting. And it goes into their idea of the paternalism. They're
libertarian paternalism.
Libertarian paternalism.
We'll come back to that term. Yeah.
But that idea that there is an inherent assumption that this is welfare promoting in what Thaler is talking about when he's defining nudges.
Yeah. So choice architecture is the giant umbrella. You could be a choice architect and do evil. You could be a choice architect and do good. It's just the idea that you have some sort of a position of power. You are setting up systems in which people must make decisions in those systems, and you are able to influence their behavior based on, human principles of behavior, human patterns of behavior. Then we get into the idea of the nudge as a tool. And like Alan, like you said, and like Thaler and Sunstein say in the book, the nudge is really setting up the choice architecture in a way that is going to promote human welfare, that is going to alter people's behavior in a predictable way. There's no forbidding. It's not about using incentives or changing economic incentives. It's not about taxes or fines. It's about setting up choices in a way that should benefit the individual based on the individual's perception of whether their choice did benefit them. So it's welfare. So if you nudge someone and they say, oh, the situation I'm in, I'm mad that I'm in this situation, by definition, it wouldn't be a nudge. Just like it's like, oh, I reinforced their behavior and then the rates of behavior go down. You didn't actually reinforce any behavior. I think it's kind of that same concept.
Like stimulus, basically, you're manipulating the stimulus conditions in the environment, and essentially, like this, most of the stuff they're talking about is like we are manipulating the environment, and these are the effects that we've seen in these large group studies.
Yeah. So we've got nudge, we've got choice architecture, and then the other term that Alan you mentioned that they talk about is libertarian paternalism, which they themselves. I heard Richard Thaler talking in on Freakonomics when the third edition came out, and I think they hate this term. I kind of wish they'd been like, wait, this term's stupid. We're going to change it completely. Because when we talk about libertarianism, I think of just do whatever you want to do. When I think of paternalism, I think of like Big Brother from 1984 telling me what I have to do. So there are two terms that do not sound like they want to help me, or they are interested in my welfare so much as they just want me to make my own decisions, or they want to tell me what to do. Which I feel
like, on Kimmy Schmidt, when they tried to pick the name of the football team that would anger the most people so that they would either buy the merchandise to wear or buy the merchandise to burn.
Oh, like the Washington gun takers?
The Washington gun takers. I feel like libertarian paternalism ignites that within me. And
I'm
it probably does for like 90% of the population hates that term for one or the other reason.
But to be fair, I thought when I read that and they were like, everybody hates this, but we're still going to use it. You know what? I felt a parallel to behavior analysis. Right? Because everybody hates our terminologies. There's been tons and tons and tons and tons of research saying that people don't like how you're talking to them, and yet we still do it.
That doesn't mean we're right,
we should do it.
It means we're stubborn. And we didn't win a Nobel
Prize. He's sticking to his guns. Like they're sticking to their guns. Like these are our term. You take it or leave it. Like this is what we're going to use. So get used to it.
See, I will defend. I don't like the libertarian paternalism as a name is awful, but I do like that they've chosen a like construct, just like we have parsimony and all of those wonderful like foundational things that we talk about as a test. They've said, listen, this is we're going to have a system that's paternalistic, meaning helping people do what's better for them, welfare promoting. But there is this element of someone else is doing this for the most part. But then libertarian, meaning that like it's still based on choice. It's still based on like motivation. There's no coercion. And you're right that those terms are very loaded, unfortunately, but they seem to be very specific to like the public policy economic side of things.
Right.
So I think that's where you kind of have to be forgiving of that, and that they're using that just like we sometimes get very jargony. They're talking to a very specific audience when they're saying that this is the feature of like choice architecture and the nudge is that it's founded on libertarian paternalism.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I wish they would have called it maternalistic. Just change it around a little bit. They are still two white dudes.
Yeah.
Right? It's a lot of white dudes, right?
Yes, exactly.
No, and I think you would actually had a better like result as far as people's interpretation of it, because there's a more positive association with that particular term. Like when you think maternal and like maternal, like people, mothers changing your behavior with their little nudges, like, and it plays with nudge really well too, if you think about it.
Yeah.
There was an air high five that happened.
Yeah. I think maternalism has a different connotation in terms of like, paternalism is like father knows best. You got to do what your dad says. Maternalism is like your mother cares about you. She's saying these things because she knows it will help you. Yeah.
Right. So they should have, especially.
Or is there a non-gender term just for parent?
Libertarian
oversight?
personalism.
Sure.
I don't know.
Or
Guardianism? Parentalism?
Oh, neither of those are good.
Yeah.
And I think in economics, again, maternalism has this idea of policies about motherhood as something in our society that has long been ignored. And so we're going to have like maternalist policies because like the relationship of like the mother and the child is something in public policy, whereas paternalism just has that idea of an extreme version being a nanny state.
Mm-hmm.
And so again, we're sort of in this world of very specific use that gets very shady.
It's not translating well outside the field.
And I agree too. And I agree, but I'm just saying like a slight shift would have appealed to the masses, just like slight shifts in our language as behavior analysts appeals better to greater communities than if we always stick
like when Ogden Lindsley did the research on like these other terms, and I think people are going to like these terms better than the terms we're using, so let's like use these terms.
Right.
And said, don't tell me what to do, Dad.
Yeah, and maybe this is just one of those places where he's not talking to the masses. He's talking to economists, because he does introduce this after the concept of like the cafeteria. He was just like, oh, here's my nice metaphor. By the way, you people in my field, this is what I'm talking about. Pay attention. Right.
And number one, don't mix the books. That's what I just want to say. Right. If you're going to make a layperson book, make a layperson book. If you're going to make an economist book, make addendum.
That is a challenge. Yeah. The second edition, I remember reading it. It felt like it was a book for readers. Anyone who was not and they even talk about this term, the econ. You're not an econ or economist. You are just someone who wants to learn more about this field. Like the breakdown of the chapters are much shorter. They have better headers. So I felt very guided through my reading. There's chapters just on like, here are some nudges you can use in your everyday life. Whereas this book, chapters just went on and on and on. The headers were very unhelpful. There were just sections where I was like, I think I must have missed the chapter on the basics of home refinancing and mortgages. And it stressed me the hell out reading it. And I was very angry.
No, and that's exactly what I thought I was missing. Like I was missing the practical applications. Like I was coming in thinking like, okay, they're giving me all this great like setup. Like, and then like practical application, almost nada. Like where is it? Like it was upsetting. That's why I wasn't very satisfied at the end. It's like you finished a meal and you're still hungry. Like what what just happened? Like I just ate, but there's still like this emptiness inside.
It definitely, the final edition probably should have been like Nudge, 3.5 version. Like, oh, it's like the expansion pack. Like read the original Nudge and then get this one. And it's like short. It's like a little pamphlet
DLC.
Or something. But you download this one to your Kindle and it gives you extra content. If you love the original Nudge, be like an expert on Nudge. Like you need like the bonus levels, so like only the hardcore, economists and nudgers and choice architects in the world can read. And then it would have been fine because I would have understood the context. But as I read it, I was like, I don't care about any half the topics. I was like so excited. We're talking about nudges and sustainability. And they're like, no, we're not going to talk about nudges and sustainability. We're going to talk about cap and trade economics. Like, no, thank you. Not why I bought this book. Not what I want to talk about. Not related to our field.
And that probably goes back to he's won a Nobel Prize at this point. Like and I don't even think it's like self-aggrandizing. I think he sees, I really got the vibe that they're like, we don't like where this is going and what we're associated with. That's not what we're talking about. So all of those like day-to-day mundane things that we talked about, those are still true. Go back and read that. Like if they just said, go back and read the old edition.
Right.
This is about like how our ideas are being applied to at the nation state level and at the corporate level. And you people, the audience needs to know. And so maybe that's also part of it is that they decided to combine them because there's that, again, that informed consent of like, you need to know where my ideas have been applied and misapplied. So again, maybe I can, I do this all the time. I don't like the book, but then I'll defend it to high heaven.
It was like a false lead. Like it was a false lead because they're like in the introduction, they're saying, this is what we were doing in the past. This is what changed in this one. Basically, we're updating those things that are necessary to update as if you're still getting the same thing you got in the last one. And we're just adding stuff that makes it more relevant to today. Whereas I feel like if I went back and read the second one from what your impressions in the beginning from those of you who read the second one, I'd get a totally different vibe from that one than I did from this.
Yeah, it's a hazy memory. I guess the key component in the introduction and the concepts we want to get over. We don't like libertarian paternalism. I don't know if they like libertarian paternalism as a term, but in terms of the concept, it's that people should be allowed to choose, and the choice architect's job should be to help them make the choices that they as individuals, the individuals themselves, would have made if they had unlimited knowledge, unlimited time.
What's in their best
unlimited
interest,
information,
right?
Complete self-control. So, if we could always make the decisions that would benefit us and we knew they'd benefit us in the future, we'd make those decisions. But that's not how humans work. We go for the reinforcer that's larger sooner than,
smaller sooner,
larger later. Yeah, we always go for those. Well, we certainly go for the larger sooner as well, I think, Dinah.
I do.
If I'm going to get it now, I want it to be big. I want a big candy bar now.
And I think that also that the choice architect doesn't benefit from those choices. Like they touch on that, but that's a big thing that I think that they really wanted to sort of highlight in multiple places and perhaps weren't as successful. A good choice architect, like the nutritionist, she's designing like a cafeteria to help children make better choices, not so that she, as like the president of NutriCorp, can have like the most profitable company when it comes to school lunches.
Right.
Yeah.
It's like putting the sugar cereal on the bottom shelf so that all the kids see it and try to grab it.
And so that's not nudging because that's not welfare promoting.
Right.
That's manipulation.
Yeah.
Right. And the other piece I think that potentially gets lost here, but is important for us as behavior analysts to take away is there's not a scenario presented here rightfully where there is no design being put forth, right? Because it's not the difference between a chaotic environment in which everyone has free will and then a carefully curated and designed environment that pushes people towards behaving in a certain way. There is always going to be behavior that's nudged and pushed in certain directions based on the environmental arrangement that's already present, right? So there's, even without a design to it, there's someone who is architecting the spaces in which we act and behave. So it's not the difference between we're living in this free-spirited place where we all can do whatever we want to, or we're in a situation of control. Our behavior is always under control of the environmental arrangement and the reinforcers available.
And they even say that, Diana, at one point, very, as you just said, there is no neutral design.
Nope.
Yes, right.
What I think one distinction they forget to make, but they allude to it throughout all the chapters, is looking at the design that's going to benefit the individual versus the design that's going to benefit the group, right? Because when you're looking at contingencies of reinforcement, right, that will benefit the group, they rarely benefit the individual. Science and Human Behavior, Skinner 1954, right? Whereas if they're designing contingencies that are going to benefit individual behavior, it's highly unlikely that then they're going to also benefit the group. So I think that's one part that they've missed a little bit, but they've alluded to it when they're talking on those grander scale things, when they're talking about more.
And we're used to thinking about behavior on the individual level, and they're likely used to thinking about behavior on the group level.
Yeah, and I mean, they do speak a little bit of, in terms of like costs, cost to society. Right. So that probably the closest in behavior, like an economist is going to get to talking about, what is the greater good having that. There's a value. There's a dollar value to the greater good if you're an economist.
I guess for behavioral economics, there's the individual in the plural. It's economy. There's.
Right.
So I guess we talked about nudge. I know, Diana, you wrote down a possible behavior analytic description of what a nudge is, because we sort of talked about the concepts behind the nudge.
I also thought Alan defined it really well.
Oh, okay. I just didn't know if you wanted to share yours as well. I liked Alan's too. We can all share them. I mean, it was an open-ended section in the notes. It was my nudge. Except it wasn't really a nudge because I wrote, we should write these in behavior analytic terms. Then I didn't write anything because I didn't want to do it. I wanted other people to do it for me. So it's not a nudge.
I think it was an SD.
It was just an SD.
Yeah.
An evil SD.
Whoa. So, I mean, just off the top of my head, I wrote that a nudge, I might define it as, it's usually antecedent modifications, like Victoria said, that might decrease response effort, build upon existing pathways to reinforcement, utilize known reinforcers for humans, such as avoiding change or avoiding aversive tasks, etc. But the pieces that Alan had in there were really important as well, which is that the person should not feel coerced into behaving in a certain way, and it should function in their own best interest to engage in the behavior.
Stop. You're all so smart. You all win.
Free operant, in a way. It's like a weirdly free operant.
Is it though? When I'm choosing my 401k, is it a free operant exactly? Because I got my form. I gotta click one of the buttons.
Rob. That's due today.
Oh God. I don't want to save money. It's too hard.
That would not be a free operant.
If only my libertarian father was here. Actually, that's different. Your libertarian father is not necessarily libertarian paternalism. So the intro goes into the idea of like econs and like this weird metaphor about the idea of I think it's sort of like that section was for economists who I think hate themselves a lot. Like they're always making fun of each other. I know, like
there's a lot of self-deprecation in there, especially when they're talking about econs and like econs act like this. I'm like,
I want to see Thaler's stand-up special. Economists drive like this,
You might be an economist.
There's little moments where like, I'm just going to point out how smart I am by saying like, oh, if you didn't know already, like those people at like a trivia game say, if you didn't know already, you people used to use a tie as a napkin.
Right. So random.
But really, I think the only thing to take out of that is, I mean, I guess if you're an economist, you're rolling on the floor laughing at this section. But if you're anybody else, you're probably just saying, oh, it sounds like most people don't have unlimited amounts of knowledge about every possible decision they need to make and have a very clear understanding of the various, market forces, whatever we want to call them, impacts on our decision-making process, that we always make the most logical decision. We're able to project what is going to be, the return of investment of every decision we make, and we do it immediately and fluently, and therefore we're always making the best decisions, versus humans who only have so much capacity to make decisions, only have so much attention that they will make towards those decisions, tend to have a number of biases that we engage in, a number of sort of shortcuts of behavior. So, patterns that just, try to, minimize our response effort for like, if someone's like, hey, do you want to talk about your taxes? No, I will engage in any behavior that allows me to escape a conversation of taxes. So again, if someone's like, this is a good decision for you, can I just write something real quick and never think about it again? That's the decision I will make, regardless of the fact that if I had unlimited time, I'd learn all about tax codes and say, ooh, actually, that's not the best decision for me because I could make these deductions. Yeah, we're not making our best decisions all the time.
No, that's what I think they came around to this moment and there stood out like forced choice. Like he was talking about this, like, and a lot of people are very resistant to being forced to choose something. And there's this status quo bias. So there's the different ways you can construct that to be like, okay, well, maybe we give you this choice, but then also make you aware of what the pre-met principle came up in many parts of this. Like if we lay out the contingency for you, maybe you'll know that there are other decisions that might be better for you, the better choices for you than this primary one that is kind of better for the company, but not as good for you.
Mm-hmm. And even then, again, talking about the heuristics, the shortcuts that it's a big part of like philosophy and economics and everything. Think about it. If we didn't have these biases and these heuristics that sometimes fail us, we would be completely immobile with choice overload. We would need all the information all the time, and we would just fritter around worried that we don't make the right choice, which a lot of people do anyway, but it would be the human condition would be choice overload.
Well, I think it was interesting. They had like in chapter 4, they laid out like, these are the situations where nudges would be useful. I'm like, thank you. This is like a nice little outline for me to look out for like all the different areas you're going to talk about in this book and why these are like fit these criteria. So like choices that require memory or have delayed effects or are difficult and frequent, offer poor feedback, or where relationship between choice and experience is ambiguous. I'm like, okay, a lot of these things, and then you kind of pull that back to behavior analysis, and a lot of these are like, okay, when the reinforcement isn't super salient, you can't see it, and you can't get the feedback of like, oh no, my golf ball didn't go the right way because I hit it this way. So like there are many different places where I'm like, okay, I can pull it back to behavior analysis. Other places were a little bit more difficult, but this area was like, I feel like the great jumping off point for me to at least see some of the other concepts in the book more from a behavior analytic level, because before that there was a lot of like large group study stuff, and I'm like, oh, I'm not even going to go into the large group study stuff. That kind of like, okay, well, what in there did you guys manipulate that really made the difference in these particular choices that people made? And like, or that any of these particular studies actually showed, what did they really show? Was there any causal effect, or did they just, again, a statistical likelihood that something happened based on this because this number of people reacted this way? And like, in some cases, like 53% of people reacted this way. Like, that seems super significant. Like from an economist perspective, absolutely. From our perspective, like I want to see more of what were the individuals in there and what was the change that actually made them go in that direction. Like it wasn't just like these large things where all these people reacted this way. It's like individuals who kind of came in here. Like I wanted to be able to zoom in on it a little bit.
And as you say, Victoria, there are moments, and this is one of them, where they could really inform behavior analytic practice. Because also not just thinking about what we do with our clients, but what we do, how we set up parent training and how we set up like all of the things that we want, that we control as choice architects in our field for our clients and their families and for the people that we serve. This is great stuff because we want them to have the best choices possible, and we want it to be an easy and welfare promoting process for them. And this is some great stuff, but they're kind of few and far between in terms of where you can find that in this book.
Yeah. Well,
I wanted more lists.
There's 2 chapters in the second edition that are just lists of nudges. And I don't know why they didn't just republish them in this book, because it's like, come on, it's you wrote it already. Put them in.
This is going to be like the 20 million word gap. I'm going to have to go through the introduction and find out where they tell you to just buy the other edition too, but read this one next.
It's in code. They nudge you. Actually, it wouldn't be a nudge because then maybe you don't want to buy their book.
Well, no, I think, again, coming back to his point, like, I think some of the stuff in chapter 5 was also starting to come to stuff I was seeing, like, okay, how can we make parent training better? So, like, patting the path of, like, least resistance to make our parents want to learn the stuff we're trying to teach them, all the basic concepts, like that. Once you have them, it makes it so much easier for you to teach your kid, because you have so many more hours in the day with them than the text that we can get out there with them, maybe 15, 20 hours a week at the most, in some cases with kids who are in school. You have millions of learning opportunities in a day, and if we teach you some of the basic concepts, it becomes second nature for you, as long as we can kind of make it easy. Like, that's one of those things that from that chapter, like, make it easy. Like, that's what we want to do for them. Make it easy, make these concepts easy, make application easy. That's exactly what, like, we need to do in order to maximize the potential of the kids we're working with and the parents who are having to be working with them. In many cases, think that they could just take a step back. If we're like, okay, the texts are coming out, I just kind of sit back, you guys do your work and do your magic. I'm like, really, no, that's like half the battle. And if we don't teach you, they're not going to, like, behavior change is not in one person, it is not in one team member. It is in everybody who happens to be in that kid's life. So that's one of the things that spoke to me in chapter 5. I was like, I want to relate that to parent training, because I think everybody can apply that kind of stuff to the parents that they're working with, and thinking about that when they're going in, and not letting, because at least the resistance to them is like, oh, the easiest thing for me is to just let you guys do your work and it will all work out. But, like, we let them know, like, really the end goal is going to be you're going to get there much faster, and you're going to get the things you want for your kid much easier or much better if you actually encourage this stuff outside of this limited time that we have with them in a week.
Mm-hmm. But then you have to think too about how are we making it difficult for parents to join in, right? And there are many ways that we probably do that, either by being, rigid or inflexible on how we're presenting parent training opportunities or the language that we're using, right? Or sort of creating a threshold that's too high as a barrier to entry, which all can then come to function as #sludge.
You just want to talk about sludge chapter.
I found the sludge chapter most useful. I don't think Rob's ready to talk about sludge.
I kind of want to go back, and before we get into some of, like, the actual purpose of the book, which would be
before we talk about the book.
What's this book going to do for us? Like, how is this book going to improve our practice, if at all? I do want to go back and talk about some of the biases they describe, and I love this chapter. I think the first two parts I did really enjoy, especially the first part, because it did really put some, I thought, pretty, I don't think they were all Thaler Sunstein words, but some kind of, like, eloquent terminology to a constellation of behavioral principles that I think capture sort of, like, how, like, there's so many German words that capture this, like, what do you call it when you've got that sense that you wish you'd done something but you hadn't done it, but you don't worry too much about it. Oh, there's some fancy German word that captures that idea. Oh, wow, that's so great. I think it captures a lot of these, like, I could describe this in 50 different behavioral principles, but nobody wants to hear me describe 50 principles. They want one word that sounds like what it is I'm talking about. And I thought, like, the first chapter talking about, like, human biases, and that also then made the later chapters in discussing this is why would be a good nudge, because you have something to sort of, some terminology to go back to in terms of the patterns of behavior. So this also, I think, gets at many of the problems that, like, Jackie, you mentioned, and, like, I know Critchfield's written about a ton, and the idea that everyone hates our terminology, so maybe we should come up with new terms, or maybe we should say, no, you can use the term, like, availability heuristic. That's shorthand for 5 principles I know, but I don't need to tell you those 5 principles. I'll just say availability heuristic. That one's not a great example, actually. I don't know if I love that one. But things like anchoring, the availability heuristic, representativeness, loss aversion, that's one that I hear about a lot in psychology, and I think is relevant to when we're talking about choice architecture, and that idea that humans tend to prefer choices that allow them to lose less than access more reinforcement, which I think is very different than what we think of. We think of, well, humans will engage in behavior that allows them to get, highest magnitude, highest quality of reinforcement. But, actually in many of our choices, we make the choice in which we lose the least, even though that sounds more like a punishment or some sort of a coercive effect. Why would, humans wouldn't choose that? That's not what our science tells us. But in economic studies, at least, unless there's a 2-to-1 chance that you're going to access that incentive, you'll make whatever choice minimizes your chance of loss, which, again, I would never think that would work. That's a very behavioral economic principle, but it plays out in a lot of their research. So I'm not sure why I feel like it doesn't come up as much, in any of our research, that idea.
Well, and I think I sort of just think about the definition that I was drawing off of as I read this, that phrase rationality failures sort of wraps around this section really well, and that we aren't rational in what we do. And at least not at all times. We have some reason that we do things, but we are not purely rational. And I would say that actually fits with behaviorism to some degree. Like, there are so many things that we do that are not based on pure cognitive verbal behavior. We just do them because we are human beings with not just learning histories, but just sort of default modes of action that most of us act on, whether or not it's what's good for us. It's just what we do and what we're comfortable doing. And as long as we don't lose a lot, why are we going to change that if it's like the easiest choice, which goes into like response cost and response effort and all that sort of thing.
Mm-hmm.
Well, and I think that status quo bias that came up in one of the earlier sections kind of speaks a lot to not necessarily the loss, but in the like just the density of reinforcement people get for simply not for letting the world take hold of their decisions and act upon them, as opposed to actually being an active actor in their own choices.
Mm-hmm. Dana, you wrote that status quo bias is an actual example of behavioral momentum. Was that you that wrote that?
I did.
So, folks, if you want to use an example,
right. We should check with Jackie.
Should we check, Jackie? Status quo bias, the idea that people will engage in the same patterns of behavior over time.
I wrote, we should probably talk about this, and then deleted it. I don't think we know enough about the status quo bias to actually characterize it as the phenomenon behavioral momentum, right? Because we don't know what the schedules of reinforcement are.
Sure.
Right? So I think,
but if we
conceptually, yes, right? But I don't know if we can say it fully, because we don't know if there was a change in the schedule from what was previous. And we don't know if behavior is still persisting in the absence of any sort of reinforcement.
Yeah, I think we want to, because it says inertia in there. Like, they use inertia in there. So like, it makes us want to be like, okay, the velocity, like behavioral momentum, like, comes in here. But I totally hear what you're saying, because I listened to those podcasts on behavioral momentum. Like, I remember it's like, I wouldn't call it a rant, but it was a very, very well done explanation of it. And then like
long form rant. Yes. I think that's fair. Right. But if we think about the definition as behavior that persists in the presence of disruption or potentially extinction, then I think it would. You're right. We don't know all of the components here, but it seemed to fit well enough that I wrote it down.
The Venn diagrams hugely overlap.
Yeah.
Like that.
I mean, right.
Because if you thinking about like low probability and high probability and like,
but that's not behavior momentum.
It's not. I know it's not.
Okay.
But again, those things get confused or often used interchangeably.
Yes.
Status quo bias, psychological inertia, behavioral momentum.
Yeah.
High probability, response sequencing, blah, blah, blah. Yeah. So I get your point.
Yeah. All of these types of terms, all of whatever all these are, I don't know what they are, framing, status quo bias, whatever. These are
patterns.
all...
They're general sort of patterns in which humans may make poor decisions for themselves.
Yeah. These are all of the types of terms that made me leave regular psychology and move to behavior analysis, because I feel like they are just adding in these additional mentalistic components. They're like, my favorite example is the foot in the door phenomenon. Like, why does it need to be a phenomenon?
I like whatever heuristic.
I don't know that.
It was a sub heuristic in one of the other sections.
But why do we need to, have special names and terms for things if we can boil them down and explain them in a more conceptually systematic way that adheres to the principles of behavior and learning that we all know and love? And I'm okay with them existing in this format as long as we can bring them down to the brass tacks level and talk about them in conceptually systematic terms. Which I think we do. We did okay. I think we can do that.
The average person doesn't want to do that.
And they don't have to. That's fine.
And if you try to do that with them, they will be like, I don't think I would like to purchase any of what you're selling.
That's not the point, though. The point is, if we're going to say that these are things that exist and they are reasons why people behave in the ways that they do, then I want them to function consistently with how we view behavior.
I felt that all of these terms, I'm going to defend them a little bit.
I'm not defending
Diana,
them.
calm down, Diana. Put the knife down, Diana. No, sorry.
Go ahead.
I'm doing an audio play. No, I did.
Really good job, Rob. Really.
Thank you.
Job.
You felt it, right? You believed it.
Really good.
Thank you. It's how I framed my statement. These were describing, and I think Thaler and Sunstein did a pretty good job describing observable behavior a lot of the time. Not all the time. And there's a section in my notes where I was like, they start talking about neuro crap, and I don't want to talk about this. Like I wrote in my notes, like, I don't want to talk about this. They're talking about automatic systems and reflective systems. I don't want to talk about any of that crap. But the terminology in terms of biases, they were talking about observable behavior. Usually it was observable verbal behavior, but it was observable. And I didn't get a lot of mentalistic descriptions. There were some, but not as much as I would expect in, say, a psychology book, where I feel like there would be much more discussion about, like, what does this mean for the self, or what does this mean for, the lizard brain? And there was a little bit of that in here, but they sort of moved away from it pretty quickly, and they focused on, this is what people are doing. You could watch people do this. Put people in a situation where the following stimuli are available. This is what they will do. And you can watch them do it. So these terms, while not very precise, did at least describe something that I could mostly see. That was my read on them, and I think they were terms that, for the most part, would probably have higher social validity than a lot of the terms you would use to describe sort of the underpinning principles behind them.
Well, it's interesting that you wanted to discard like automatic systems, because that goes into like motivating operations, and actually bringing up those two things actually makes me want to revisit Diana's point. And I think she's right that at the very least, status quo bias is highly related to and built upon behavioral momentum as sort of a theoretical construct. Because if we think about persistence of behavior or sets of behaviors, then automatic systems and status quo, those things all tie together, which is exactly what we try to do. So that's an important part that we can't throw away, Rob. Like those, when he talks about those things, it's related to a lot of what we talk about and what we are trying in our field to account for in our interventions now in a way we haven't before. Thinking of like condition motivating operations, when you have this automatic response to something, walking into your workplace. If it's a toxic environment, you're just going to immediately start to be punished just for being there. And that plays exactly into those automatic systems and plays into behavior momentum. Like the behaviors that we have or don't have is going to be related to our the reinforcement or punishment of those behaviors in the environment.
That's true, but behavior momentum as a phenomenon really has to deal with changes in reinforcement, right? So I agree with you all, but we have to make sure that we're not tacking a phenomenon to something that we don't know all of the systems around, right? That's like the one thing that Nevin gets super pissed about in all of his readings. He's like, if you don't know if there's a change in reinforcement, because if your work environment was always toxic, right, and there's little reinforcement there, that wouldn't be an example of behavior persisting because of behavior momentum, because that's how it always was, right? But we do need to see that change. But I agree with you, too, that just because we can't see those types of things that they're talking about doesn't mean that they're not valid and don't play a huge role in why we engage in the behavior that we engage in, right? Like, for instance, I listen to this podcast when I drive to work called Stories Podcast. It's young children's stories because I have a child. And I was like, oh, man, I got to clean the floor. Like, 6 weeks after we listened to one, she goes, you have to clean the floor? We have hardwood? We should get a Bona, right? And it was because of the commercial in Story's podcast. She's like, Bona hardwood is very good for kids, and she like repeated the whole thing. We heard it like 2 times, and I was like, but right, it was at that point that was salient, right? Because she's going to listen to her favorite story about whatever, Max Goodname. You guys, if you're listening, it's great. And I think there was no disruption there, but the behavior still persisted. So I think we just have to make sure, because the only reason I'm such a stickler at this is because everybody screws it up, right?
Yeah.
And
I like the Venn diagram. So here's behavioral momentum, and like maybe status quo bias is sort of like it's kind of in there because it could certainly fall under behavioral momentum, but it also 100%
could, but it also couldn't. Yeah.
So
I think there might be an actual example that if we were to actually see the study, it's like one of those things where I meant to go actually look at it, like the one where the verbal behavior of the group, like, and the impact on the last person in that group, like all these people saying something that is a patently wrong thing, and then that last person saying, "Oh, I agree that wrong thing is true." I'm like, okay, like I want to go back and look at that, because it's like that is an example of a change in a schedule of reinforcement. It's an observational learning experience. Like I see all these people are getting reinforced for their answer, even though in my mind I'm like, that feels wrong, but again,
right.
Let's
move to that. I think, Victoria, the idea that because we talk about biases, and that the first chapter is really sort of just like the individual and various processes that will lead us to not making the best decisions. And in chapter 3, kind of jumping ahead a little bit, there's also the added problem of humans engaging patterns of behavior that we would consider, as an outside observer, would consider incorrect based on their social environment. So, Victoria, you brought up that the example of everyone says this is the right answer, even though they're wrong. There's like a 75% chance that you're going to change your answer to be the same as everybody else's answer, even though you're right and they are all wrong. It's like the raising your hand in school principle. It's like, who thinks the answer is 4? And when no one raises their hand, you're like, oh man, maybe I'm wrong. I'm going to keep my hand down and just sort of, coast through this one.
And Skinner talks at length about this when he talks about group contingencies, right? Because our social environment is in fact our group. So in this example, it's like a classic example of following group norms because of our third level of selection, right? That cultural level of selection where rule-governed behavior says I go with my group. This is what my group says, what has happened in the past when I've gone against the group, right? Punishment, isolation, loss of reinforcers, loss of potential primary reinforcers, right? Your house, your food, all your money, even those are conditioned, but right. So I think that is like a classic example of demonstrating the power of a group and the power that group contingencies hold, right? Because you're looking at, okay, I know everybody else is wrong, but I'm going to say it anyway, because if I don't, I lose all of these valuable reinforcers that I can't get on my own.
Right, because I think, and then they spoke to that in this particular piece because they're like, okay, but if you take that away and you're anonymous, you're going to go back to the right answer because the group contingency is removed. Like you don't see all these other people, and you're removed from the punishment contingency there. It's like, okay, nobody's going to know that I'm answering right if they're all answering differently because I'm answering anonymously. So I get to hold my whatever you might want to call that integrity. We want to put a word to it, but like integrity and like quotation marks. But
yeah, and they one of the examples they give in terms of how I think this process, they talk about that lab experiment, but how this process plays out in the real world, especially with the proliferation of immediate social media access, was the example of the HPV immunization programs in Colombia. And it was startling that this program the government put in place, they're going to get everyone vaccinated, and they had this huge success in the first couple of years they were engaging in it. They had like 88% of I can't remember if it was adolescents or individuals, but whatever their target population was getting their first shot or was scheduled to get their vaccination for HPV. And then some girls had an adverse reaction, and scientists looked at it later and said, no, the reactions had nothing to do with the vaccine, but there were enough videos of individuals having a bad reaction following, some temporal distance from getting their vaccine shot, that the vaccination rates dropped from 88% to 5% over the span of, I think it was like a year. And, again, doesn't matter that it's the same idea of, no, science says that everyone was right that got the vaccine and it was just a fluke and it was unrelated to the vaccine. But what matters is everybody saw it, or individuals, the target population saw it, and it was almost, might as well have done nothing. They might as well have just scrapped the whole project based on the responses to a few videos. They didn't say the exact number of videos, how many views they had, or anything like that. But just the idea that, huge swaths of individuals will significantly change behavior based on very little, some information, very little information. If it's,
but it has to be salient,
presented,
right?
It's salient. Yeah, good. That's the word, Jackie. If it's salient, can change behavior. So, you can say, no, this is the best. This is, I'm the choice architect. I'm nudging. This is the best outcome for you. And I bet you would agree, but it doesn't necessarily take much for all of that work to be for naught and be almost utterly worthless in terms of changing human behavior.
I couldn't help thinking about the HPV commercial that's happening now. Like the lady, if you haven't seen it, it's got a blue background and she's like, "Stop cancer." And I just love it so much. Every time it comes out.
The one that we watch is a guy running a race.
Oh.
That's the Hulu one.
I hate those ads.
Yeah. This is a Hulu one too. We get different Hulu advertisements.
Oh my goodness. They think that I am a man who runs races.
What's the choice architecture behind designing those ads? I don't understand.
No, but it makes me giggle every time. I usually put it on mute, but I turn it up. That one.
Yeah, I think in the same one, this was where they were talking about informational cascades and like that in the PNW, where like a few people were like, this representatives are saying this could be vandals, and then like it spreads to the whole area. Right. Like everybody believes it's vandals now. We need federal intervention, and then like we actually have scientists come in and like, guys, it's cool your jets. It's not vandals.
It was hail, right?
It was like rocks or like gravel.
No, it was just rocks. Like they were just saying, like this is just something that, like, if you were to look at it, it's like because it wasn't salient. People weren't like looking until they were looking at the windshield.
It was always there.
It was always there. So like if you had a windshield for a certain amount of time, you're going to start seeing that. Like if you're looking,
it's like my love for all of you. It's always there.
Oh.
It's not the work of vandals.
This is just a great example, which they don't explicitly call out, of how design is not neutral. Like those informational cascades, which is that idea that the information you receive is shaped by the choices that other people make as they give you that information. And then that reputational cascade of, we don't question because we don't want to be reprised for disagreeing with someone who seems to have a reputation for expertise. Mm-hmm. That's a great example of that choice, that design is non-neutral, that everything that we do, especially thinking about, again, what we do as behavior analysts, we make choices and filter out tons of information that may or may not be relevant. And that's also where we meet some misinformation, in that we're like, whoa, I don't know where that's coming from, because that wasn't a set of information that I filtered out in terms of our conversation. So yeah, I just think that's a great point of like, we could really think about this and how we present choices to people and how we engage in conversations with parents, and making sure that our informational cascades don't be that they're not coercive or manipulative. That they're.
I think that speaks to something I've been seeing on a lot of behavior analyst like pages that are like, there's people who are very curious about like this. There's this like anti-movement, like based on really bad some of the terrible history. So like there's just some of that has sustained, and there's some people who may have gotten bad bad ABA, like when it was still like we are using punishment as our primary tool. And like, so yeah, they probably have a very, very negative association, like a very aversive conditioning. Like, okay, you think ABA is bad because people used punishment on you to try and change your behavior. And that's what you see as ABA now. So you go and tell everybody, don't use this, even though what we use today is entirely different than what was used on them. Mm-hmm. That created that reputation for them.
Or we hope it is.
Right.
Well, yeah. we hope it is. So, I mean, in some cases, that's the whole idea of like this ethics code and bringing about like people actually thinking and talking about the ethics of our decisions and what we're promoting and how we're creating the change we like want to see in an ethical way.
Yeah. And the speed with which things or these ideas can move now in our culture is vastly different than it used to be. So I did appreciate that we were reading the newest version of this book because it had really highly relevant and recent examples included in it. And, you get that feeling like whenever you have a book, you're like, yeah, but what would they say now? Like even if it's just a few years old, like things have been changing so much on that landscape that you think that this is what they're saying may be outdated or may not be as applicable as it could be. But this book was like just written. So it had a lot of examples that did.
We'll just update it.
Sorry. A lot of it, I think, was just written.
Yeah. I can tell the sections that were just written.
So this discussion related to informational cascading, they did refer to social media and how fast things can move.
Mm-hmm. I think that also goes to the idea, just kind of jumping around to that idea of which they call the availability heuristic. And that idea that, well, if you asked, an average person, like, how much do behavior analysts use punishment and like cruel treatments to change behavior? Well, if you have, a couple people who are prominent or popular and they posted more recently on social media about like a story about someone using, electric shock or using some sort of a punishment. It was a big news story. Then individuals, when asked that question, will be like, I don't know, like probably like 90%. They'll come up with a biased answer because when they engage in problem solving, think about kind of, we think about memory, they're gonna refer like, well, what have I heard about that? Oh, I heard like some posts recently. And I think as a society, we haven't quite gotten to a point of understanding the difference. Well, I don't want to be that reductive, but the idea of what we see in front of us, we're not econs, right? We're humans. We see something in front of us. We're not necessarily saying, where did I see that? Was that in a reputable source? Was that in a peer-reviewed journal? All I remember is I know there was a story talking about exactly what you're asking me. And the fact that I saw a story recently about how terrible behavior analysis is, but I didn't see one recently saying how great behavior analysis is, I will err on the side of it's probably more terrible than it is good. And that might be one of the reasons that we, as a field, can be so unpopular, because there are just always a few of those stories about how terrible we all are that get out there. And individuals, we can't expect people to be like, oh, come on, but you looked at the journals, right? You looked at the statistics on how great behavior analysis is, right? Because the average person's like, well, no, I don't you need a behavior analyst. It sounded fine to me, but I know I saw these stories. So when they asked me the question, this is how I problem solved my answer, even though it was based on very little information. And we can't blame people for doing that, because it is a human bias that we all will engage in. Just we wouldn't do that about behavior analysis because we think about it all the time. Yeah.
Right? It's
exactly.
Which is why it's important to have ABAI coming out with statement after statement of like, this is not what we are doing. We decry these practices, whether it's the electric shock or other such practices. Yeah.
APBA.
Yeah.
APBA. That was the one recently.
Mass ABA just did too.
Mass ABA. Okay. I was thinking about ABAI and their recent stuff on conversion therapy, which is a whole nother thing, but it's still an important part that we have our professional organizations trying to be part of these big conversations. And it's really a shame that news media outlets don't be like, oh, hey, this like 10,000 member organization came up with a big statement. Maybe we should talk about that. That's one of those informational cascades that some journalists didn't decide to pick up the story because it's not.
Well, I also think that speaks to how those organizations could be doing better. Like they could be applying some of this stuff because I don't think a lot of them have great representation out there. Like a lot of these people who are as loud as they are because they are part of like groups that have thousands and thousands and thousands of members, that means the information spreads very quickly when one person posts to that group. And that's just like a parent who had like a bad experience themselves when they were little. And now they're like, I just don't want anybody to have to experience what I experienced. So I'm going to share my story and it's going to resonate with everybody, because even if you have just a child on the spectrum, if you have one commonality in there, it speaks to you for your own child and for your experience. I'm like, oh, wow, I'm going to apply that to my own life, my own child. Why would I want to put them through what this person says was one of the worst experiences of their lives in this Facebook group that I happen to belong to? Because I'm a parent with an autistic child that's looking for help, that's looking for a support system. And that's one of the main places they seek it is on social media, because that's what social media for many people is a means of searching for a support system for difficult things you're going through.
Mm. Well, I want us to get a little bit more into, we've talked about a lot of the biases and a lot of how that can impact, us as professionals, as well as, beyond the content of the book. And I want to get into sort of like where would we use nudges, or when are nudges useful? But before we do that, I want to make sure that our listeners get their first secret code word. Remember, if you're listening to this in the current year and you're a patron, you just put these in and you're going to go to the original post and you get CEs. Hooray! If you're listening to this like a year from now in the far, far future, when the double final edition of Nudge has finally been released, with even more discussion of boring behavioral economics terminology, then
zombie robot dogs.
Then you would just go to the CE page and you'd put all this stuff in as well. But then, there's a little fee there. But the first code word, regardless, snooze, SNOOZE. I noticed that when Diana read Nudge, she most of the time was snooze.
No, it's not true. It's
That's not true. I've been snoozing a lot.
Jackie's always snooze-ing. It's not snoozing though, it's snooze. Snooze. Okay.
Do you want to be a BCBA?
Sure, we all do.
Now you can come to Regis College in Weston, Mass. to get your graduate degree.
Choose from any one of these courses.
Masters of Science in Applied Behavior Analysis.
Masters of Science in Special Education.
Dual degree in Special Ed and ABA.
Or be eligible for your postmaster's certificate.
You can complete your degree and be ready to sit for the exam in 2 years. And our 2017 grads had a 100% pass rate on the BACB exam.
Come enjoy practicum placement support, ethics mini handbooks, PhD level professors, small class sizes, and a service trip to Iceland.
If interested, don't delay. Supplies are limited. Learn more at regiscollege.edu.
Again, that's www.regiscollege.edu, regiscollege.edu. One more time, www.regiscollege.edu.
See you there!
All right, so we talked about a lot of the biases. We talked about a lot of the patterns of behavior that individuals will engage in. The next section really gets into the idea of, okay, well, what's up with nudging? When would it come into play? And I like sort of the little descriptions of sort of just like, this is when it felt like an ad for nudging. Like, when is a nudge right for me? And then you'd have the actress, we were talking about like the ads for things, you'd have the actress go, because sometimes I just forget, and some guy go, because sometimes it's hard to choose. Because technology can't always help me easily. Because it's a problem I rarely have to deal with. Because the feedback of my behavior is unclear or hidden. Because I know what I like, but the choices don't map to my likes clearly.
That would be a cowboy.
That would be
I think this section starts speaking to like the some of the supervision stuff you guys have done before with like the pick, like this, some of these are like, okay, we want things to be immediate, and I'm not going to do many more callbacks on previous episodes.
Yeah. In
I
media, it's
immediately
good.
forget them, Victoria.
They record
and
it and then they go.
I like he gives some very vivid examples of what's not a nudge. So
Mhm.
like Adolf Hitler being the only candidate on a yes ticket with a teeny tiny
letters.
little no in the corner. That is not nudging. That is coercion. That is manipulation.
I mean,
But
it is,
he really
it is kind
thought
of
he was the
vivid.
best person to vote for, though.
But it's important though, because thinking about like ballot design, like the Leave versus Remain, did Leave win because it was the first one on the ballot, or because that's what people wanted?
Mhm.
Can I tell you, Alan? I am on our faculty governance at our college, and I had this conversation for 4 hours one day. And I was like, guys, I actually don't care. But it's true. It was a very long discussion. So you have to like randomize. Should you randomize each one to make sure, right? Is there a side bias? I always pick the first. I always pick the last. Whew, it is something.
Well, this section is as often like I actually started like writing lots and lots of notes on this particular, like for chapter 4 is where like I started like a copious notes, because I was like, I want to try and figure out how to apply this stuff to my company, to like apply a nudge to leadership to start taking ethics more serious in ethics discussions. Because I was just listening to one of your ethics podcasts, and like more companies seem to have those kinds of discussions and ongoing discussions, because I don't think enough do, at least not from my experience with the companies I've been with. And like maybe I should be able to try and apply this, because, you know, it's one of those times where the effects are delayed. Like long-term impact of being an ethical company is going to be good for you, maybe not your bottom line, but good for all the practitioners there and everybody who happens to practice under those ethical practitioners. But it's going to take a long time to actually feel those effects.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great point, Victoria. I mean, I think it kind of, you know, ethics might even fall into that kind of nudge category of it's a problem that you rarely have to deal with. And I know we all know, because we're like students of ethics, and, you know, we look at our ethics code, we're paying attention to the changes in ethics, that we're really thinking about how ethics is a part of every single decision we make. But when it comes down to it, like, when's the last time ethics actually really kind of bit you on the backside? We're like, oh, there's a big ethics investigation. That doesn't happen that often. So it makes it one of those behaviors of, I have to pay attention to ethics, but you don't necessarily get feedback as to how you're paying attention to ethics. It rarely becomes a problem that you will have to deal with in terms of, I have to change my behavior because I got in trouble, or I'm trying to avoid getting in trouble for an poor ethical decision making on my part. So yeah, I think ethics and nudges probably go hand in hand. You don't always get feedback on your ethical behavior. Like, no one's going around like, hey, I noticed you being ethical. Great job on that. Like, nobody says anything about it. Jackie would. But other than Jackie, unless Jackie's your supervisor, no one's saying boo about ethics to you until you've made a mistake with ethics. And then you're just getting, you know, hopefully you're getting, you know, good feedback and support as to how can we fix this problem? How can we make sure there's little harm done? How can we do better in the future? But you may just be getting in trouble depending on the organization you work with, and you got fired and you never learn anything. Nudges.
Well, and I was just going to add to Victoria's point that, and this section, in terms of the design of the book, is very useful in that, man, like, here's a quick blurb about this, maybe some practical examples, like the spacing out of, like, pilots need checklists because pilots cannot, like, remember to do the things they need to do to keep people alive. Mm-hmm. And it is vital. And like, so giving them a checklist is a great, like, that's welfare promoting. Like, they have the autonomy to do what they need to do. It maybe not a nudge because it improves outcomes in a huge way that not having is in place. But again, lots of great examples and lots of like, oh, great. Like, there's a nice non-jargony way to talk about this in a conversation with like parents. And like, I want to talk about like, you know, like all the ways that we space out in the decisions that we make and why like these errors may be cropping up with your child or like whatever. So I really liked this section and had a lot of notes too.
Mm.
Yeah,
It's making me feel bad about all my lack of note taking.
Well, it's more about the checklist. I think it's more about the systems. Like, I get super excited when there's a new, I don't know if it's like Linda LeBlanc or Matt Broadhead or something, like, look, it's a checklist or it's a decision tree. Because as much as I, you know, been doing this long enough that part of me is like, I want to make my decisions and I don't want anyone to tell me this. I I can opt out. I don't have to read that checklist. I don't have to decide which measurement system I'm going to use based on the decision tree in the article. But the fact that it's there, you know what? I can opt into this, and it might save me the trouble of making a mistake because, I know all this information, but like, I don't really want to spend a lot of time thinking about my measurement systems that much. I want to look at the data. I want to analyze the data. I want to do the training. So if this is going to save me 5 minutes of, agonizing over database, which data system to use, great, whatever. It's a nice, easy system. I dodge any, mistakes. And if I don't want to use it, I don't have to. Like, all I do, I put it aside and just make my decision on my measurement system. So I love a good checklist nudge.
It's a great way of using like reduced response effort to encourage ethical behavior. Like,
one of my hardcore bookmarks in the new Cooper, in the 3rd edition of Cooper, is that decision tree of like which one to do in terms of like, here's a good way to talk about decision making. And then even in, I think Bailey and Bird's, like how to be productive, like, will this take more than 5 minutes? Put it in this pile. Will it take more, like that's, I'm all about those things too.
I like the way these are structured. Like, Rob, you ran through them really fast, right? But it was like, because sometimes I
dramatized
forget.
them.
It's hard. Sometimes it's hard to choose. Sometimes I haven't ever done this before, right? And there's a study or a paper that's really good called by Allen and Warzak 2000, and it's called the title's not good. It's like parental or reasons for parental non-adherence to treatment, which is just like a terrible way to
deal with your
phrase
jerk parents.
Something, but the content's really good. But I feel like if we were to present to parents, like, these might be some of the reasons why this is challenging, to go back to Victoria's earlier example, right? And put it in this type of terminology, then it would be a lot easier to understand, comprehend, and then maybe be motivated as well to make change versus calling something parental non-adherence.
The problem of parental non-adherence in clinical behavior analysis, effective treatment is not enough.
Thank you. It's a good article. I just wish the title were different.
Yeah.
Thanks for doing my job, Alan.
Oh, of course. Theory nerd. I love that stuff.
You get a pass this week, Jackie. Like, you're usually a superstar note taker.
So, I mean, we've got all those times that a nudge is going to come into place, and I feel like the next couple chapters really sort of just reiterate those points or get into more examples. That doesn't mean we have to stop talking about them, but just the general theme.
There's actually another important point for our application in the field that I wanted to bring up at this point in the buy-in of using AAC devices. Like, I can't tell you the number of cases where it's like the parent is so resistant to that because they are holding on so tightly to vocalizations as like that's what they want as their primary mode of communication. And it's one of these areas where it's just because they may not see how valuable the switch over might be for not just their child, but their whole entire family. And so it's one of those things about making it more clear to them in order to help create that buy-in. And even if you want to take another step back, creating the social validity, like, how about you present the child with the choice of how they want to communicate and see, even in that perspective, like, see if your kid is choosing to use this device over trying to vocalize. That should tell you something about what they want to be using to communicate with you and the rest of the family.
And on the sort of that's a great point, Victoria, because that also makes me think of the other side of that, the snake oil salesman that they talk about, how popularity in sort of the market sense is not a good sign by itself that something is valuable. Buy-in can go the wrong way as well. The shady Western saloon, the quack doctor, that kind of setup. And that's relevant to our field too, because those accusations still get thrown at us and we need to be able to respond to that. So,
Jackie, would you feel better if I sang an entire musical number about being a quack doctor at the turn of the 20th century?
If you did that, I'm shutting my computer off, just so you know.
Especially if you did it, Rob. I'm so sorry to say.
But I do want to say that when I think about buy-in, I've really tried to reconceptualize how I'm talking about it. And we talk about buy-in a lot when we're talking with parents and we're talking with teachers. And I've been trying to change my own language to talk about it as a collaboration, right? Instead of buy-in, because when you use the word buy-in, I think we're inherently saying that we know what we're doing when we don't, right?
It's got this very Glengarry Glen Ross.
I don't know who those people are, but
it's a movie, it's a play. ABC is always be closing. It's really the idea that we're selling them on something. Like, I'm going to tell you all these things, and you're going to want to buy what I'm selling. And I think if we could take a couple things from the book, but really the idea of we're not trying to convince the family of anything. What we are trying to do is set up choice architectures that are systems that allow for them to make decisions. Now, we can't give them every choice ever because, ethically, we're not able to give them every choice ever. We have to limit what choices we're able to provide because we only are one professional. But we can look at, well, what are the decisions we're asking parents to make? Where can we put as little response effort requirement as possible? Are we setting up systems, even thinking about like the paperwork or intake paperwork? Are we thinking about our systems having, the stimuli in our systems sort of being consistent with what we expect them to do? I like the example that they have in the book of they have this like long paragraph, it's like 2 pages discussing this like fancy door handle in one of their classrooms. And it's designed in a way that everyone assumes this handle is so beautiful, I must need to pull it. But it's actually supposed to push. So students will try to like leave the room and they'll be yanking on the stupid door because it looks like, no, this is something I would pull, right? And so just putting that in our design and like our paperwork and what we're asking parents to do so that it's easy and it makes sense in terms of this is what behavior you're probably going to engage in when you see these cues. And we're not going to, pull a fast one on you in terms of actually we wanted you to write something into this box, not click something into this box.
Yeah, and I agree with Victoria too with the whole concept of AAC devices, right? Because they can and are a great tool, not only to promote language also, right? But also to teach the structure of language. And I think for us as architects to build the environment so those advantages are demonstrated, right? So that it's more of like this is going to be better for me and my family and my child versus this is what I as the provider want you to do, right? But look how the environment can be better. And so I appreciate that you brought that up because I myself had spent many a night in the shower thinking about collaboration and buy-in and how to reframe how I teach about it and how I think about it when I'm working with parents and clients to make sure that I'm not putting myself in the position of what, we would so-call like the better, right? Because I don't know.
It's like we're not telling you have to. We just want to make it clear that this is what it can do if you do allow it in.
Yes. Mm-hmm. Yep.
What about the idea? I'm thinking of like the idea of the default option, and they refer to it as the prompted choice. So the idea that as the client, as the stakeholder, the families, the client, they will get to choose the aspects of our treatment models and our treatment options. They would get to choose those. However, there are going to be some amount of defaults. I'm thinking about a lot of families coming to our ask for our services. And they've just gotten, the child's just gotten a diagnosis of autism. So they might not have an answer as to like, well, what communication modality do you want to use the most? Would it be fair to have some of those initial intakes have a bit of choice architecture? So it's like, it's okay if you don't know exactly what this is. We can always discuss it. Our default option until you've made a decision is we use AAC for our younger students, or we use this procedure or that procedure. Where do you think that would fall in terms of choice architecture for families? Because again, some families come in and they know exactly what they want, and they can always say, no, these are the treatment options I want. This is what I'm looking for. But some families are like, I just want you to help my kid be happy. And I think there's a huge difference between these are the procedures we use, and you as a parent are able to make as many decisions as you want to. However, we do have some sort of defaults we might start with until we have more information on your child and their preferences, or your child's able to communicate their wants and needs a little better, versus, just sort of doing stuff and assuming that the parents don't know what we're doing. That's the same as that they've consented. It's similar to, I think, the chapter on organ donation, just being like, everyone gives organs. That's the rule now. That increases the amount of organ donors, but does it really increase the amount of individuals who have knowledge of what it is they are agreeing to. So, that kind of prompted design, that default, like there's a default in some of the treatment options we might use for students.
I think so. When you talk about that, I'm thinking like prompting hierarchies. Am I?
Yes. Small stuff. Small. I'm not talking like huge.
Okay.
Yeah. Small things that are not going to be harmful, that we will change based on data. But if we don't have that data yet, or the parents haven't, they haven't received enough information yet to determine which directions they'd like to go with certain things. If it's a young child who's currently is nonverbal, would we start with an AAC device? Like, that's our default. Like, here are the options, but if you're not sure or you don't want to pick one, we'll start using an AAC device just to start, and then based on what we observe from the student, we'll make modifications as time goes on.
Well, I think that brings up some of the areas like that they talk about just a little bit later. I think the exclusion is important. The elimination by aspects. So I think that's one of those that kind of speaks to, if we're going to talk about communication modality, I bring it down to like, if we're going to, I want to help them choose by eliminations. Like, if this is important to you, or we're going to eliminate this one. If you're not willing to, say, learn ASL, I'm not going to present ASL as the primary communication modality for you. So like there's a number of, that's why that's what spoke to me as soon as you said that, is like this, these are the aspects to each of these that we can choose. So you still have a choice. And if we give you all of the options out there at the beginning, that would be overwhelming. So I can still help guide you to the one that you ultimately choose for us to use for your child, by helping you to eliminate those things that you are not willing or not able to use or invest in.
Mm-hmm. And I think even calling it the default might be problematic, because the idea is, I want you to understand what your values are going into this. Mm-hmm. I have my own thoughts as someone contributing to this relationship. I would choose this based on the values that you've just shared with me, but I want to make sure that's clear. So again, adding that little bit of the difference in like presumed consent and informed consent. But I also somewhere in this section, he talks about how sometimes it's not clear what the best option is. And so it's just important to just choose one and revisit that in a time that matters. So thinking about like cancer treatment, like that got my attention. As I've shared before, I've had my own issues with a GI cancer diagnosis, that something runs in my family, and we ended up doing the waiting approach because it's what was best for me in my case. But my doctor insisted that it be my choice, because he could not guarantee X, Y, or Z. And he was like, I'm not going to strong arm you into this. It's not my place. You have shared with me your reality and your understanding of what's happening. I think that you are informed, and I will gladly make a recommendation, but I don't think there's a wrong choice. I think it's just the choice we need to make and then revisit in 6 months, that kind of thing. And I think that applies to therapy. Like, let's try an AAC device, or let's try selection-based, a low-tech option, and see if we get that, and then revisit that often. Because I feel that often we present these things as like, this is what we're going to do, and we're not going to back out of it, especially if we call it the default choice.
Well, and I appreciate your clarifying. I use default just because that was, it's one of the terms in the book. So it's just kind of like, would something like that relate to kind of the work we do? I think it does carry more of a connotation of who cares to some extent. We talk about default, when that really wouldn't be the component. It would be more, what are the things that if there's no decision to be made, do we have treatment options, or do we have, we're always going to default to reinforcement over punishment, right? Would probably be the only one you'd have like a pretty clear, like, unless a parent's like, no, you have to use punishment. Even then we wouldn't. Even then we wouldn't, but we would have to have that discussion as to why we would not, but we should default to reinforcement.
We are ethically obliged to do so.
Yes. But the idea of coming back to the decisions, I think that does get at the idea of the nudge. Like, what is it? We can't give every option. Like, here are the ways that you can, for automatically reinforced behavior, here are your treatment options. That's not helpful to a parent. They don't have the background. They don't have the research knowledge. They might not have the time. I'm sure they would want to. But again, like we talked about in some of the earlier chapters and Thaler and Sunstein talk about, if parents could study all of these things, they would, but they don't have time because unless they are behavior analysts, they have a totally different job. And they also want to spend time with their child in ways that are not just in the context of these therapies. So, that curated response probably makes the most sense. And some of the default is going to be, it's going to be reinforcement based. Whatever treatment we come up with is going to be reinforcement based. And then, but again, like the idea of the nudge and the idea of a good choice architect, we're going to keep, like you said, Al, we're going to keep coming back to these options. You can opt out of any of these treatments at any time. And I think this lends itself really nicely to our ethical code of you don't like what's here. It's so easy to opt out of treatment A and move to treatment, B or C, because we didn't go into a lot of detail about them because we thought it was overwhelming. We just gave you A and B, but there are other options available. We just didn't bring them up at the time because we did not think that was going to be the best decision to make at the time, based on the context, based on what your interests were, but we can always come back to them, and it takes very little effort. So in that way, I think a lot of what we're recommending to parents, we could think about how do we use these in terms of a nudge. I mean, again, it's a little different in that parents are coming to us to say, we want a treatment, we want the following things to happen for our child. It's not quite the same as like a mortgage or
well, I think what you're saying is really important, because I think there are certain parts of a treatment plan where you are not necessarily going to have the full discussion, because as you said, like a behavior plan in itself and all the components of a behavior plan, that would be super overwhelming if we asked them to individualize every single choice on a behavior plan we're creating for their child. Whereas something where like man's maybe a default, like, okay, we almost are always going to work on man's. Like there's not a treatment plan where you're not going to work on probably some type of man unless we're talking about a really advanced learner. So like in most cases, you're going to work on man's, whereas the behavior plan, there's a very, very big menu of choices there. And while I can take in your values and kind of input them into my plan, like I know some parents are going to be totally against escape extinction, because I'm like, okay, I will not, we'll find a way around escape extinction, because, well, it might be a good choice. There might be better choices for you and your family.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Well, and just the idea of default, I revisited one of my notes. It's the idea of a sensible default is something that we like.
Yes.
That is, I like that phrase, as sensible. We have some sensible defaults when we are designing an initial behavior plan. Some ideas that we go to first because if they don't work, they help inform the next step.
Yeah.
I do also want to bring up that, there's a whole section on defaults when it comes to choosing like 401k or whatever the Swedish
your phone plan.
The Swedish definition. There's a whole chapter about Sweden choosing their plans for investments. So like our equivalent of a 401k, whatever it's called in Sweden. And the idea that a good default has to be chosen by an expert who is thinking about the best interest of the individual, that we are always taking a stance on whatever our default is as to how much we want individuals to choose the default or be, as Thaler and Sunstein call them, active choosers, meaning like pick everything. How, depending on the topic, depending on the area, humans aren't necessarily the best at active choosing because they don't have the knowledge, the background knowledge, and they don't have the attention to continue assessing how well or not well their active choices are done. I do think that's an extra step that didn't come up quite as much in our discussion of our field, but I think is relevant more to our field than, say, some of the other, investment chapters. The idea of revisiting what's going on and using that data in a meaningful way frequently versus, say, the investment chapter. Because one of the problems that they ran into in Sweden with their investments is most people chose an option and then that was it. That is their retirement option forever. And the problem that runs into retirement, which is not necessarily a problem that we might run into, is just because you made a choice, the odds that you then change that choice over time is slim, but you need to always be investing more than you probably started with, because most of us are like, well, I don't want to lose any money. Like, I need money every day. I can't put it all into my investment because that's a problem for the future. And, they talk about like, well, here are ways to get around that. Here's ways that you can use, money, knowledge to improve that. For us, we don't have that same problem in that, to some extent, maybe we do, but like treatment options aren't the same as our retirement investment. But we are coming back and using that information to make better treatment options, either more fine-tuned treatment option or to fade treatments that are no longer needed. So, regardless of what our defaults are, regardless of how much or how little active choice we're putting into our choice architecture when it comes to choosing the behavior plan, choosing the targets for intervention, we always need to be coming back with that information and making sure that it's salient and relevant to the families that we work with so that they can continue to feel like they're being, maybe nudged in certain directions because they can opt out and they can knowledgeably opt out. And we're making it transparent. I was just kind of thinking about that like smart disclosure chapter, which, how can we use data systems? How can we use technology to make this information easier for parents to see? Like, I know there are a lot of online curricula now for programs. It's like, hey, the data gets graphed so parents can see right away, like, look, the line's going up or the line's going down. And that's immediate feedback. Because if you give parents like, here's a bunch of percentages, I don't know. I can't understand percentages if you just throw a bunch of numbers at me necessarily without studying them, without knowing all the context. So, how can we share our data? How can we share our information with families in a way that, it correlates to what they already know rather than, there's an ethical responsibility, but we want to make sure people can understand what they're seeing. How do we use technology to do that?
These chapters reminded me of our ethical obligation to do a risk-benefit analysis when we do treatment options and to provide those to our clients. So I'm just pulling it back to ethics.
But it's got to be, but it's got to be in information that our stakeholders can understand.
Yeah.
And we as the architects need to understand what's going to be salient to them because they have that wonderful example of people chose the worst investment option overall because it had a lower deductible.
Yeah.
And
where Harrison Ford was in the ads for it. That was very popular.
Yeah, but just the idea of like, oh, maybe we should have like had an information campaign explaining to people that although the deductible is higher, this is not perhaps the best option for you given your situation.
Right.
And yeah,
I like that chapter simply because I never understand what a deductible is. And that chapter literally is, if you remember one thing, it's take the plan that's got the high deductible. That's the plan you want. Maybe not quite as relevant to like our day-to-day work, but you know what? That's a good life lesson, I guess. Go for the big deductible. We're getting close to the end, and I feel like we've been putting a lot of the themes into practice, which is awesome. But I know you want to talk about sludge.
I want to talk about sludge too, so you go at it, Diana.
Let's do it. Sludge. #sludge is the name of the chapter. This was a newer concept. This was not in the last edition.
They're so relevant with the hashtag.
I know. I loved it because they put a hashtag on it, so you know that it was hip and new. So the concept of sludge is that if nudges are architectural choices that make behavior easier and more beneficial for the individual, then sludges are architectural choices that slow or bog people down in red tape and silly rules and regulations that make it harder for the individual to benefit, and very likely that a larger corporation is instead going to benefit. So I found this terminology to be more useful, I think, than maybe some of the nudge terminology. Maybe it was because I'd already heard of nudges and I hadn't heard of sludges. Because this is like everything in my life that I hate is sludge. And I liked having a term for it and a way to sort of conceptualize it and think about it. It's not the kind of chapter where they're like, and this is a way to get rid of sludge, right? But they just identified areas where it probably is present.
I think I just wanted to complain about that subscription to the Royal Times or whatever.
Right, yeah.
They couldn't easily get out of.
Yes. Well, every day I have to go through the ABA Inside Track email account and unsubscribe from all this random crap that we get subscribed to. Somehow, Randy, if you're out there, stop using our email as your own email, because I'm getting all of these emails from Roundup and I don't want them anymore. Alan, what did you want to say?
Well, I had highlighted some choice architects intentionally impose sludge, inserting friction into a process in order to achieve goals of their own. Making it hard to cancel a membership or a subscription is an example. Making it hard for people to vote, qualify for job training, or get contraceptives is another. And even on a larger scale, thinking about like in the infamous examples of bridges in certain neighborhoods in New York being built in a way that buses from like Hispanic and historically Black neighborhoods couldn't go to the beach because a bus wouldn't fit under the bridge. That's a nice way, like sludge is a nice term to tie that level of institutional like racism to like the like self-serving unsubscribe button in a really neat little package. Disgusting, but neat little package.
That's a great parallel. Pull in.
Yeah. I mean, I think what areas do we find sludge in our field? I mean, I'm going to be honest. I think when we have an ethical concern, I think that is a very sludgy process, to the point that I can't imagine most people want to put an ethical violation in, because the amount of paperwork you need and documentation is so much. Like the response effort is so high that you start saying, maybe it's not that big a deal. I'll ask them nicely again to stop, engaging in their unethical behavior. That'll probably do it.
I can say that recertifying now is not sludgy anymore. Now that you can like upload certificates, right? Because you're not going to get audited. That's what I think anyway. I think it's gotten less sludgy. But applying to the BACB is the sludgiest of sludge there has ever been. So if they have never read Chapter 8, #sludge, they should, because to be fair, I haven't applied to the BACB for my certification since 2005. But what I can say is that all my students have, and it is a nightmare. Like one time, one girl, right? They were like, "Oh, you didn't turn your transcript in for this one degree." And she's like, "Yeah, I did." And the BACB's like, "No, you didn't." And then I had to call ABAI to help. And they just didn't scroll down to didn't scroll
to the bottom of the page.
Didn't scroll to the bottom of the page. Like, they're like,
where it said degree conferred on the bottom.
Yep. Oh, my bad. After like 4.5 months of like,
or rushing, like in some cases, because they don't understand the untraditional structure. Like I was one of those people who had like a hybrid master's program. So like I had all the like BCS stuff first, and then I took my master's work courses. So I spent 2 separate transcripts, but they were from the same school. So when they got one that said T's for all the BCS stuff, I'm like, well, your application's been denied because there's no grades here. There's only T's. I'm like, that's because they're transferred from the BCS,
the other
continuing education department. And it's like, it's ridiculous. I'm like, I'd have a fight with them because I'm like, no, you're going to get one because they are sending that one paper. So like, well, you got one electronic, one's coming paper. It will be in, and you guys just don't rush to reject me because you're like, didn't meet all of our requirements on input.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I think that's the sludgiest part, Alan.
No, well, I was thinking about the documentation system. Like we're going to provide. We're going to provide a fieldwork tracker that doesn't meet all the requirements. That if you get audited, oh my goodness.
Yeah.
But then,
oh my goodness.
But then, Alan, they're going to have everybody start using it, and then they're going to be like, "JK, nobody needs to use it anymore," but not tell anyone except put it in fine print in the handbook until you email them. And they're like, "Oh, you can still use it, but we no longer fix it."
You know what? The supervision process, that's sludge. That like everything about it. It's so sludgy. Every year it's like, I'm not supervising anybody ever again because it changes and there's like more sludge. And they mention that in the chapter, like we have to be somewhat patient with individuals when like we're going to try a new system because every new system comes with all of the sludge that the old system has. And very little of the feedback as to whether this will be better or not. So it's like sludge plus system nobody understands. But it is painful. It is painful to have to use. And I think it does turn a lot of individuals off from engaging in otherwise pro-social and helpful behavior because, we're loss averse. And I'm losing a lot of time when I have to engage in any sort of sludge response.
And then to bring it back to our families, the entire process from trying to initially get EI referrals, diagnoses, services through the school district, insurance companies, that entire process. Like what we are dealing with for certification is 1% of what that process is like for parents. It's entirely sludge and really unbeneficial to the clients.
How long some are waiting just to get services, like that is appalling. Because at some point, like doctors are recommending it when it would be the most beneficial when they're like 2 years old, and then they're coming in to actually get services and they're like 3.5 or 4. I'm like, we lost a lot of time because this procedure that you guys have, like the muck of all this, it's the sludge, just ruined like the chances that we had. Like probably could have been an exponential behavior change versus what's going to be more difficult now.
Yeah,
because of how long it took to get in.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and then the rural inaccessibility of information, like that's something I deal with. Of like, I can't, like, you need resources beyond what I maybe can offer. I will try to get this information to you, but because you can't find it in one centralized place, means it's going to be a challenge for me. But at least I have maybe the time to do it. But then it becomes like this big gross monster of. This is not an easy process to get. Yeah.
Sludge monster.
and I think also another thing about sludge that's important is we talked a lot about in terms of just like inefficiency of like paperwork. But anytime you have anything that's like either a hidden fee or hidden expectations, and it's not just readily apparent, here's what you need, here's what you're going to get, here's what you're paying for. All of that falls under that category of sludge because it is frustrating, and it does slow every process down when I signed the documents. I did all the things I needed to do. Oh, actually, this won't cover that. That won't cover this. I mean, I just know from my own insurance, which is looking at very few, thankfully, very few actual medical needs. I can't imagine what families have to go through in terms of, actually, that's not covered. How would you have known that? Oh, you wouldn't have, because we specifically made it hard for you to understand that. I don't want to paint with too broad a brush. I'm not up on insurance regulations
about where,
and changes.
One of those like medical expenses is like a good thing to put your money in.
The deductible.
No, not that part. The flexible spending.
Oh, like your flexible. Yeah.
Yeah. I never do them anyway because it was too confusing. They're like, the old version was bad. The new version is good. It's like, what? I still don't understand the difference. It's all too complicated.
One of the things that came to mind as well is like most companies' handling of RBTs or BTs. And like that is just so sludgy. In many cases, like you make it difficult for them to understand what it takes for them to actually get benefits in many cases. And that's a really critical factor for many people when they're choosing employment. It's like, I could have sure thing benefits somewhere else. With you, I have variable hour employment. So only if I hit this average number of hours am I actually going to get it. And I have to average over this number of weeks. So I'm like that just, wow.
But it's sludgy for the purpose of the business, which is 100% not benefiting your clients, your stakeholders, your employees. It really is meant to hide things so that you can like try to take advantage of the people that are working with you, and that doesn't benefit the service that you are now providing as well. So that's like a double win.
Right, and then the turnover that ends up creating doesn't end up helping anybody. Right, the business ends up losing on that one.
Yeah.
Cough, cough, Medicaid for all. Cough, cough.
That doesn't sound very libertarian to me, paternalist. All right. Well, I know we're getting kind of close where we need to start wrapping up the episode. I think we're in a good place because honestly, part 1 and 2, I think have given us a lot to think about, a lot to discuss, and a lot that we can bring back to our own practice. Part 3 on money. I guess read it if you're interested in economics. It is not as good in this version. We talked a little bit about some of the ideas related to retirement and choice architecture and that, but it really is literally, hey, would you like to learn a little bit more about how credit cards and mortgages work? If the answer is yes, great, read those sections, but they're not relevant to our podcast, so we're not going to talk about them. Unless anyone wants to talk about them, like
no.
Okay. We talked about the change in default being sort of just the choice in terms of looking at Sweden and their choice architecture. We kind of already talked about that. One thing I was very disappointed in was this chapter on saving the planet, because in the original book, there were some nudges. This chapter really felt like, anyway, there's nothing we can do with nudges. Like, here's some ideas for nudges. Maybe they'll work a little bit. But honestly, we need to look at like big cap and trade and economic incentives. It's probably right, but it also means take this out of your book because it's not related to nudges.
No, it feels like they're disconnected from like what the actual like other science is saying on like what behaviors actually need to be done. Cause like I was just like informing myself on like more meaningful changes. We don't just have to reduce emissions. Like I'm not going to go on this tangent right now, but like there was this beautiful new documentary that actually gave me hope for our environment if we can actually get the people with the information, the right information, and start using these kinds of procedures to help nudge people in the right direction. That chapter was the biggest disappointment in the whole entire book for me. I was like, wow, like why?
Well, and see, this is to me one of the examples of when this has been misapplied or sloppily applied, and he's done. Because we talk about like saving the planet and nudging the individual. What is it, like 100 companies in the world produce 71% of our emissions. So that is why nudging is perhaps not as relevant as people have tried to make it. And that's why, so like, don't talk about nudging in terms of this because I, Thaler, am tired of it. Not, yeah.
That's the thing is it seems like they're ignorant of the newer science on drawdown theory. And that's I'm not going to go into what that actually means. It's just pulling the legacy load out of the atmosphere as opposed to trying to reduce what we're putting in year to year. It's like because the soil can handle the carbon if like we do the right things and like encourage farmers to do different things. Like, so there's like a lot of little systems, little cultures that if we were using nudges in the right way, I think could be really, really beneficial and could be really productive discussion. So I was like, I'm not going to go too far into that because some of those really, really liberal people who want to use our science for good.
So, Victoria, from your perspective, the idea is that they're missing. They missed the nudges that would have made sense to put in the book, and what they put in didn't fit the rest. Like, I think, like I was saying,
right? It doesn't fit the most current science on climate change, right? Because there's like a number of scientists are saying we don't need to pay as much attention to emissions now, and they were so focused on emissions that they weren't paying attention to the fact that a lot of scientists are saying what we need to pay attention to is this, and this, and this that are going to help the soil be able to handle and take back in the carbon that's in the atmosphere currently, so we can actually have a reversal of the temperature change trend.
Okay, so that's a I mean they're older guys, so maybe they're not as into that area. It's not as directly related to say like what we think of as economics of climate change policy. I was disappointed in that. I think some of the simple nudges that they mentioned very briefly, the idea of using visuals. I mean, and we talked about some of these on other episodes. Like using visuals or giving more feedback as to how much power individuals are using. They sort of gloss over that as, I think, a very useful nudge that you could use to significantly change people's overall energy use. And they kind of are like, yeah, thermostats that stay on, and you can send people their power bill and they can see it a little bit. Like they really didn't focus as much on meaningful nudges. They talked a little bit about the idea too of using their what's the term? It's like the not systematic design. It's like chapter 7, smart disclosure.
Oh, yeah, smart. Okay.
Smart disclosure to look at things like the amount of toxic gases or toxic material that businesses are putting out. But then that felt very coercive in terms of like it wasn't a nudge. It was like it would be great to use smart disclosure so that everyone knew how terrible these companies were, so that they could punish them, so that they would stop engaging in the same amount of, disposing of toxic chemicals in the environment. But that didn't feel like a nudge so much as it did a means of, setting up coercive consequences for some of these companies, which was against nudging. I mean, maybe it falls into the category because the companies can maybe easily change their behavior, but I'm guessing it's not that easy for the company. I mean, maybe it is. I don't know. I don't want to be too much on the side of big business when it comes to changing their behavior, but
I think that's one of those things is that a corporation is not an individual.
Mm-hmm.
And I think they especially in the epilogue, when they really revisit that pessimism of like, we still want to be a force for good, but some of these, like the difference of when we wrote this in 2008 and what this now, we have creative companies, and then they list every like media giant that
they loved Netflix so much.
Yeah. And yeah, so I think that they are saying that there has to be there have to be limits on when we talk about nudge. Nudge can't be the only force we use, but if we use it, it can be a force for good, but it cannot fix everything, which I think a lot of people have tried to push nudge theory as that. So again, they're talking to people that aren't us as the regular audience.
Well, speaking to the audience that they were actually talking to, I think the self nudge portion, the snudge area, was also disappointing in that you could have gone so deep into what people would have been really interested in, how do you use these concepts to work through some of the stuff that they find important in their own lives to change things that they want to change in themselves. Mm-hmm. As I know, self-management is a very loaded topic. I'm not going to go into that, but I'm just saying that Snudge was kind of disappointing, another disappointing section where there was so much potential and you guys missed that mark.
I mean, that's why I feel like this final edition should have been the expansion pack to the original Nudge, in that it's if you liked everything you read in Nudge, and if you liked these concepts, and if you like these ideas, here's some more information. This won't solve everything. Nudges are not a panacea. Here's how you can use them. Here's how you shouldn't use them. Here's how they've been misused. Here's some common misunderstandings. But when you put it all into one book, I read that chapter on sustainability, and it just felt why is this? They should have just cut this whole chapter out. I get the concept, but the second they were going to say, you know what, nudges aren't going to be the only solution. Great, stop talking about it. I didn't buy the book Thaler and Sunstein's fun environmental ideas using economics. I bought the book Nudge. I want to talk about nudges. So if you don't have a nudge, just have a chapter saying, here's some ways nudges might not work as well as we'd like, and leave it at that. So it was just very disappointing to go through an entire chapter feeling like you had no good idea. Maybe they had good ideas. I don't know. They weren't the ideas I was trying to learn about in the context of this book. They were big economic theories about emissions, and I didn't care. I'm not going to change that. It's not changeable for me.
And one of the direct applications of our science was there in chapter 6 with the lottery, where they actually used positive and negative reinforcement. I was are we going to talk about whether they use those words appropriately or not? Because
yeah, they didn't, but that's okay.
Okay.
It wasn't as egregious as other books I've read that use those phrases.
It wasn't as bad. I brought that to my class the night that I read it, and I was look, they use the words, but they use them wrong. Don't. Bye.
All
right. I think we need to wrap it up.
Let's wrap it up.
I just want to say I liked the organ donation chapter. I thought they did a good job of bringing that in. I don't know if people agree with me.
I think are you thinking, Diana, of the idea of the difference between perceived consent and informed consent?
I thought that they painted it in a fairly complex way, and then circled back around to at the end talking about what the actual rates were for different countries, and that it's not always what you might think based on the way in which that choice architecture had been made for the country. So it was, for me, it was just okay, it's not an easy answer, right? Mm-hmm. And they didn't have a solid answer necessarily at the end of the chapter, which I kind of liked that, but everyone should sign up to be an organ donor.
Mm-hmm. It's so easy. I didn't know it was hard in it. In Massachusetts, it's just, do you want to be an organ donor when you get your license? And honestly, you're so jazzed that you have a license that you'll say yes to anything at that point. So I wonder, was it really informed consent, or was I just excited to be able to drive a car?
Right. Yeah. They did say maybe you should revisit.
No, I want to be an organ donor.
When you're 16.
I read that chapter and I said, you know what? Nope, still want to be an organ donor. Yeah, 16-and-a-half-year-old Rob still wants to be an organ donor after all these years.
That's all I'm going to say.
All right.
Time to go.
Well, let's bring it up. Everyone, I want to hear everybody's last thoughts on overall thoughts of book, and if anything, what are you taking from this book to put into your own practice as a clinician, as an ethical provider of behavior analytics services, as a human versus an econ?
I'm definitely not an econ, I can say.
None of us are econs, Jack. I think that's the point of the chapter, when none of us can be econs. Even Richard Thaler, Nobel laureate, is not an econ.
But what I can take away, I think, which has helped me craft some of my more recent research and how I've been thinking about training with our newer staff, is that nudges are only as effective as the environment and the salient stimuli in which you're using. right? So I, as the choice architect, may find that this specific cue or variable may be salient to me. So I put it into the environment, right? But it may not be salient to anyone else based on our different learning histories, right? And where we are in the context of our lives. For example, we're doing a study right now looking at hand sanitizer use. And we thought, we'll put some signs up in front of the cafeteria and that will modify hand sanitizer use. Nope, not at all. 0 rates across all conditions, right? So what I thought was going to be very salient, like use bright colors, right? Big friendly signs, not like the you will die if you don't use hand sanitizer signs, right? I was like, this is going to be salient. Not at all. So what I have done as a choice architect is misread the context in which I wanted the behavior to occur. And so I think that is that's what I really took away from the book, is that nudges are only as good as the environment in which they've been arranged.
You need more pictures with Harrison Ford on those signs. If Sweden has taught us anything.
Right? I guess.
That's not a bad idea.
I know.
Harrison Ford uses hand sanitizer.
It's actually not a bad idea, Jackie.
Actually, Jackie, make that. That's the next phase. Harrison Ford pictures.
Phase prime.
A funny picture.
Okay.
A celebrity telling them to do it.
Yeah.
So, me just on the board. Like the Virginia Slims lady from the 80s.
Make sure you have a cigarette in your poster as well. Yeah.
My very long fingers.
You could have, well, that doesn't work. I was like trying to think of a salient version, not Niles and not from Frasier, not Len, from the Big Bang Theory.
Sheldon?
Sheldon, not Sheldon. So you have to find somebody, a Stranger Things type of character, maybe. I say my takeaway from the book, though, is just that idea that a good choice architect makes choices that promote the well-being of the individual and not themselves.
I like that, Ellen.
Yeah.
Great.
That is very important. And I think when people talk about nudge theory, that gets left out.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
And especially for those behavior analysts working in the private sector where financial gain is a factor, it's important that they understand that they may be being coercive or manipulative or problematic rather than just nudging one way or another.
Right on, Ellen.
Yeah. It's one more point that we can bring up to people when they misuse nudge. Like, actually, since it serves your own self-interest, that by definition is not a nudge. Thank you. I'll leave now. Nobody wants. Let me redefine reinforcement for you while I'm going. You're spot on now. It's totally right. Victoria,
I'm gonna use a quote from chapter 6. I was like, I underlined it, made it in bold, capital letters, make it fun. So like when I was like trying to encourage instructional control, it's all about making it fun so they want to choose to participate. So that's where that was one of my takeaways, is like, okay, this is how I can apply this to our science other than some of the other stuff I've already mentioned. Make it fun.
Okay. That's a good point, Victoria. Diana, how about you?
When I was reading this, I texted to you, some of you, that I felt like the final edition introduced a lot of sludge to nudge. And
nudge 2, sludge.
I know there's still a lot of good nuggets in here, and I really thought Alan's points were great, and making it fun and easy is definitely also important when you're talking about nudges. But I kind of wish I'd read the second edition. It seemed a little bit more streamlined.
Okay, I have a quibble. Is there a second edition, or is it just like a second reprint? Because I only see a 2000. I'm aiming this at Rob, not at you.
It's
he's the one who introduced the idea of the second edition.
I don't know if they mean it to be second edition, but it is Nudge Revised and Expanded Edition. So there is a Nudge which has 1 elephant on the front, and then there's the one I have, which is Revised and Expanded Edition with 2 elephants, and then there's the final edition, which we all read, which has 3 elephants. So in that regard, it's not exactly a second edition. I think I've been calling it that, but it is referred to as revised and expanded. So there's new stuff in there.
You have takeaway? You're done.
I sort of liked, I think the positive of reading this again is if you just read that second edition, or if you just read, what are some common nudges? They seem like little fun tricks. But really, when you think about what it means to be a choice a choice architect, there is a level of responsibility to that. And I don't think, because we're humans, we always put as much weight on how we're framing decisions, how we're framing our systems, how we're framing those interactions as part of choice architecture. We sort of just do it. And we assume that, well, our data will get us to the right answer, or our convincing tone of voice will get us to the right answer. And it allows us to skip a lot of steps that might allow us to, use nudging in the way it's meant, in that we're trying to give the decision-making power to the individuals that we're supporting, rather than just telling them what to do. And I think the more we think about choice architecture and the possibility of where would a nudge come into place, and I think we came up with a lot of great examples in our discussion tonight, we really can get at that core process of including our clients and including our stakeholders in the decision-making process, rather than just trying to convince them that we are right and they should do what we say because we have the knowledge. Because that is not the same as using some of these techniques. Also, fun nudge for everyone at home. Has anyone seen those toilets where when you flush them, if you want to use less water, you pull up on the toilet, and if you push down, why the hell don't they make it push down to use less water? Because doesn't everyone push down? Isn't that our default? I push down on the toilet lever. It's bad design. It's bad choice architecture.
It's that stimulus response compatibility that we didn't really actually talk about, but was a concept in there.
Yep.
So
drives me nuts. Yeah, drives me nuts. So if I take anything
I
from
like
this
to
book,
use my foot to do it, and it's very hard
you're not gonna
to
kick it up.
pull it up with your foot.
So we're always going to use more water.
Tip yourself over.
Who designed that? That's terrible.
Great observation.
Choice
Thank God
so if I learned
here.
anything, it's that I think the choice architecture for those flush toilets is terrible. Just terrible.
Okay.
That's free. That's just free for everyone out there. It's a free little BOMO. All right. Well, that wraps up our Nudge Book Club. We're going to do our second code word right now. It's snudge. SNUDG. It's a self nudge. Victoria, you brought it up a little bit. We didn't really get too much into the self nudge section, but it will live on as a code word. Snudge.
Yeah. It's like that Snuggie. Right? Like the snuggle blanket?
That's just a Snuggie.
It's a Snudgie.
I want a Snuggie so bad right now.
I know you do.
I think Snudge is a children's cartoon from the 80s. The Snudges.
Is that for real? Or you just made that up?
Made that up. Okay. It sounds like Smurf.
You're thinking about the Snorkels.
Or I'm thinking of the Snorks.
The Snorks.
Now you're thinking of the Torkelsons.
Okay, time to go.
Okay, time to go. All right. Well, thank you everyone out there for listening. If you're hearing this in 2021, that means you are subscribing to us on Patreon, and we so thank you. It really gives us the motivation to do these super long book club podcasts. Thank you to Victoria. Thank you to Alan, both of you, for being here on the show, on the discussion. I think you added so much, especially, I don't know if it's a nudge if we just have to do less work when other people join us here or not. I guess maybe not really.
We actually have to do more work because they have a really thoughtful discussion, and so we have to be thoughtful with their thoughts.
It's a good point.
Solid.
It's been a long podcast. Okay. Well, we hope you all, if you haven't read Nudge, hey, you know what? I think unlike some of our book clubs, we really couldn't cover everything in this book. So if you heard some of this and say, that sounds good to me, check it out. We might say maybe start with the revised and expanded edition. See if you like that. But again, I think the first half of the book is very solid and I think directly applicable to behavior analytic practice. Well, that brings us to the end of the episode. Remember, you can join us yourself on these if you like to with smart people like Alan and Victoria and add some more to our next book club, which we'll be doing in, where are we now? This is coming out in kind of late November. So that's going to be in the spring. We'll have our spring book club. We don't know what the topic's going to be yet. But until next book club, thank you all so much for listening. Thank you all so much for being here and adding so much to a discussion of a book that was a little up and down for all of us. We really appreciate it. And we'll see everybody at the next book club in a few months. So long. Goodbye.
Bye.
Bye.